All right. Well, I am going to get into announcements, and like I said, it's going to be concerning the same thing that all of my announcements are, which is the deadline coming up, which is August 14th at 11:59 p.m. And I wanted to go a little bit more in depth into that deadline and exactly what the requirements are. So, as you know, all 6 assignments must be turned in, and they must be graded on Canvas. So you should have a 1 for each assignment on Canvas by August 14th at 11:59 p.m. If you do not, then you will be dropped from the course. However, that doesn't mean that you would be done with launch code. It means you would still have access to the curriculum. You can still reapply to a future course. You can still use our curriculum to create your own application and apply directly to our candidate pool after you finish your application. So there's still a lot more pathways available, just in case, let's say you don't make the deadline. I know this is a very time-sensitive course, and it can be very difficult to manage, especially if you have full-time job, other life situations happening simultaneously. So just know that even if you are unable to make the deadline, you are dropped from the course, you still have other recourses available to you. And you can always shoot me an email about what those would be if you would like more information, or send me a Slack message about those. So yeah, just make sure and keep those demos going. Schedule them as soon as possible. If there's enough demand, or if there are enough people who can't make things scheduled, I'll be available for the last weekend prior to the deadline to make sure that we get as many, so I can demo assignments, just to make sure that everyone has a time available that they can get those demos done. And yeah, that's all I have for my announcements, Carrie.
Thanks, Colin. Okay. Let me get my screen back up. All right. So tonight we are talking about React, and I am super excited about it because you're going to be able to create some really cool stuff once you get the basics down. Okay, announcements, lecture studio, same old format. Colin just talked about the graded assignment demo and deadlines. I will have a video coming in the next few days for an intro to graded assignment number 6, your last one. But of course, we still have a couple more classes to get through for you to learn everything you need to finish it. So don't panic. Okay, so there's a meetup, let's see, on Tuesday the 8th. Yes, Tuesday the 8th for folks in Kansas City, and Philly and St. Louis, as far as I know, are still to be announced for the next meetups. Okay, let's get into React. React is a JavaScript library for web apps. There's a lot to talk about here. We'll talk about the difference between libraries and frameworks. I want to hit on modern import and export syntax, which is talked about a little bit in the React Part 2 chapter, but it's something I actually would have preferred to have covered last week. So I'm actually rolling that for future use into my class 17 stuff, but we'll do that real quick. And then we'll talk about the concept of a component, since React is a component-based architecture, and then how to create a React app, how to create React components, how to use them to actually get them to appear on the page, and then how you can make them reusable with props. Now, this is something that they sort of mention a little bit in the Part 1 chapter, and then in Part 2, they get into it a little bit more. I'm actually going to teach you the basics tonight because I want to go ahead and cover that now. And my lecture example tonight is going to use it just a little bit because I really want to show you how valuable components are because they're reusable, and props are a big part of that. And then we'll talk about different ways you can use CSS with React, and I'll show you a little bit of that too. Okay, so libraries and frameworks. These are just tools for creating JavaScript applications. Libraries like React and Vue and Svelte, and there are others, they basically are just providing, they'll pull together a bunch of other like libraries and tools and have their own syntax. And this will help you render things in the web pages in the browser. That's really all they're concerned with. But a framework examples are Next.js, SvelteKit, Angular, and more. Those provide functionality for the entire application, a lot of the other things that need to be in place for the application to fully work, instead of just focusing on the rendering like libraries do. So you might say, well, does that mean that React is less powerful than something else if it's not a framework? And that the answer is absolutely no. It's very lightweight and it's fast. It's what makes it so great to use. And you can pair it with a lot of things. I've used it professionally with Redux to handle a lot of the things like making the API calls and those kinds of things. But you can and handling storage of data and things like that. But you can absolutely use it for the vast majority of what you need to right up front, and it's loads on the client side and is fantastic. So we're going to talk more about this in just a second. Let me get through this import export syntax. So you may remember in the past you used Replit, and those were common JavaScript files which did not support the use of certain syntax. So you were using require, and you had the module.exports and things like that for exporting. Well, now you're going to have much more straightforward syntax. So this modern syntax for importing and exporting uses the export keyword for every item to be exported, and default along with export will allow you to just have one particular thing from that file that you're exporting, and you can just refer to it directly. And I'll show you what that looks like on the importing side in a second. So in this example here, like on the single export, you could just have your function defined, const add nums, you pass in A and B and you return A plus B, right? And you can just export that as the default and say add nums, just like that. Or if you have multiple functions that you want to export, you might have add nums and subtract nums. You can put export in front of each of them and then be able to grab them all at once from the import, the place where you want to import it into. So here's the keywords for that, export and default. And then here's how you import. So at the very top of the file, just like you did before with require, but this time you're going to use just different syntax, you're going to use the import and from keywords. And it just basically says import this thing from this file, right? If something was a default export, you can refer to it by name directly. So in this first example here, you can see I'm just saying import add nums from add. And that would be like this, if in this fictitious example, this is the file name. But this is where I said export default. Then you can refer to it directly like this. But if you actually have multiple exports, you can use destructuring, which I did talk about last class. And I actually taught this to you back when we talked about importing and exporting with the old syntax too, because this part still works. But you can basically still use them by name if you deconstruct them from the entire export object that's coming from your file. So I may have had, export in front of, add nums and export in front of subtract nums. And then, behind the scenes, it's just bringing them both over. And so I can just deconstruct them like this to access them both by name. So that's pretty much that. So there again, here's your keywords, import and from. And there's your direct reference where you're just using add nums because it was a default. And then here's where you destructure when you have multiple things that have been exported from the same file. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples of this. And if you are looking for this in the code, I did put this in my class 17 lecture examples repo. So we've got a number of things here we want to test. We want to test calculate total and get random index and get title case, but they exist in these other files. So calculate total is the only thing here. And I just want to export it as the default. So I can just say export default, calculate total, just like that. Something I want to point out is that sometimes you may see export default in front of a function or a class. That works as long as it is a class or a function with the function keyword. But if you use a const like this to do an arrow function, you actually have to do it after the fact. I don't know why, but that's the only way it seems to work for me. So, but this is actually what I see a lot, like, in regular use professionally. So it's totally normal to continue just doing the export at the very bottom like this if you want to when you have a default. And that's it. So then for this file, we want to export these. And this is a case where we don't need to have a single statement. None of them are really going to be the default. So all I need to do is just put export on the front of each of them like this, and that'll make them available. So now when I come over here and I do my imports, I can say import, and I can start to say calculate total, and notice it already seems to know about it. That's because of me having put the export on there. And you can see already, if you look to the right there, it knows that it's in calc.js. So all I have to do now is hit the tab key and it finishes it for me. And I don't know why I did that, but oh, there we go. Okay. And then again, I can say, I want to go get random index, comma, get title case. And it knows that they're both in util. So it finished it for me. VS Code's pretty smart that way. There you go. I mean, that was pretty easy. It was pretty painless, right? But those are examples of, a default export and then multiple exports where I've used destructuring. And now I can use all of those function names directly. I don't have to have any sort of dot notation or anything because I did this deconstruction. All right, let's run it. Let's pull this up and let's see, what directory am I in? In module examples? Yeah, good. Okay. Node main.js. I'm just going to run it right here. And I have an error. Of course. Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, sometimes it's going to be real persnickety about whether or not you have the .js on the end. I'm glad this happened. So watch out for that. In this case, it's requiring me to do it. When you're working in a framework, sometimes those things have been taken care of, but I didn't. I just created my own package.json file that is making these modules for me. There we go. Okay. So yeah, sometimes when you are not using a framework and you just have a little, package.json file, it might be a little more particular if you don't have extra configurations in there. So there we go. We have, 333, the random number is 12, and Pride and Prejudice. And of course I can, do this again and get 94 for the random number, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, hey, I got 12 twice. Look at that. Out of that whole array. Isn't that funny? Okay, so that's it. Import, export from, those are the keywords. That's how you do it. So let's go back over here and talk about components. And then as we get into using these components in React, when we create an app in a minute, all of this knowledge about importing and exporting is going to become incredibly relevant. Okay, so building blocks. Components are building blocks. Basically, component is just a block of code, specifically JSX, actually. It says it returns HTML. Really, for React, that means JSX. And it's placed anywhere in the application. You can just define it in one spot and then use it anywhere. So you can build an entire web application with components that are defined out of one or more JavaScript modules. And sometimes components are single use and others are reusable. You might have one big one, say, for example, for this entire page, and then it might be built of, a component for this top part, or like, these ones here, you could have 3 of the exact same component, different instances with unique information passed in. That's where the props come in. And those would be considered reusable, right? The other thing is that some of them can be very complex and some of them are extremely simple. They might even just be one line of JSX, a single element or something. It just depends on what you need. But the beauty of it is that large or small, it's modular. So you can, define things once in a single place and then use them, as much as needed. They can be made very flexible depending on, how much information you want to be variable, and be able to pass in to, have something be, one color or a different color, or one size or another size. There's lots of different ways to manipulate that. And still be using the same component. So we're going to look at the components themselves in a minute, but I just wanted to make sure you kind of understood the concept here. Let's talk about how you create a React application using Create React App. This is a tool that Meta created, makes it very easy to create a simple React application. I just found this out. This was not even true a few weeks ago, I don't think, but they don't support global installation anymore. So you may have to install it locally every single time you create a new app. It might also be that it's just because I've had it installed that way before that it is making me do that every time, but it's making me do it every time now, locally. So the first step is to install it with npm I or install create React app. And then you can create the actual application you want to create using npx, which stands for, oh, wow. I'm like, node package something that starts with an EX. Wow. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. I thought I had that one down. npx, create React app project name. And that, of course, would be whatever your project name is. But it is traditional to use lowercase hyphenated for project names. And then you would navigate into that directory, because if you're going to actually be able to run it, you have to be inside the project directory that you just created. And then you use npm start, and that will allow you to serve the application. So by serve, I mean, open it up and have it actively running. And for most cases, it's going to default to open up at localhost 3000. So you remember in the past that whenever I was doing like a regular vanilla JavaScript application with the DOM, that I would use the live server extension in VS Code to make it do this, right? You're not going to have to do that separately anymore because it's built in. You just use that command npm start and it does it for you. And it should automatically just bring it up in the browser without you having to go and type in localhost 3000. If you ever have an instance where the application won't serve, this especially happens if you have forked someone else's existing application and you're using it for the first time. Or maybe it's something that you created a few years ago and haven't used for a while. You might just have to update the dependencies, and then that's just npm install. And then when you try the npm start, it should go. Okay, so let's see. Let's go ahead and do this actually. Come over here. And I have my repo here, unit 1 React examples, which is going to serve for the next 3 classes, including tonight. And I'm just going to create a new app right here. And I want to make sure that I call it the right thing. So give me a second. Here we go. Okay. So I'm just going to say, now if I try doing this npx create React app and say garden planning tool, we'll see if it'll do it. Yeah, so this is the error that I've been getting. So if this happens to you, it says you're running it, and the global installation's no longer supported. And I've already done the uninstalls, with the global flag here. So basically, it just means that you need to do the npm install, or you could just do npm I, create React app, and have it install it locally right here. And then once it's done that, you can come back and do your npx create React app with the name of the project you want to create. And then it should go through. And it'll take just a second to download everything and get it all set. But you can see already it's created, these files over here. And we see a package.json file. We don't have anything else yet. There it is. Now it's got the node modules. And what we're really waiting to see are the source and public folders. There we go, public and source. Okay, so now we have, everything that Create React App, did for us. It created all of these files, a nice structure for everything. And inside the source file is where all of the code is typically that you're going to want to add to. Now, over here in the public folder are a few things like the actual indexed h.html page that the browser taps into, along with, some other things like the little icon for the, the tab on the browser, things like that. But most of your file is going to be in here. Like there's, some global CSS that can be put in here or in here. There's the app.js file is kind of the top component that returns this JSX here. And so we can see this by actually spinning up the application. So let me navigate into the folder, the folder I just created, the garden planning tool folder. And now I can say npm start, and I'm going to make this bigger so you can see what's happening. Okay, and it is opening up for me on my other screen. So let me move it. Decided to use a different window. Okay, and you see a working little React app with a little spinning logo. This is the default information that we just saw over here. Oh my goodness. Okay, right here. They've got, this logo, and they've, got some classes on here and things like that. And it says Learn React, and that's it. So we will replace this as we add content to our project, but that's it. Once you see that, it's up and running, everything's good. You can actually see, if I go back to the terminal here, I now have this running. This is going to stay running unless I cancel it or something happens that makes it quit itself. Sometimes an error happens, it'll make it stop. But you can force it to stop by using Control-C. Whether you're on a Mac or a PC, it's Control, not Command. And then you can just start it right back up again with npm start. Now, something that I like to do when I'm developing this way with something in Angular or React or Svelte or whatever, is I create a second window here using this little button so that I can have one for managing stopping and starting the application, because sometimes I do need to stop it for reasons. And then another one for managing all of my Git commits and anything else I need to do in the terminal here. So I recommend you do that. Use this split terminal so that you can kind of have both happening in the same place, all in one screen. And of course, you can always hide and bring this back up as often as you need to. Okay, so that's how you create an app and make sure it's running. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about the components themselves and the syntax. You just witnessed a little bit of it with that app component. There are two variations in syntax. So React 16.8 was released in 2019, and they made some sweeping changes, like big changes. Not all of them I will be able to explain to you tonight because we're not there yet. I'll explain more of it on class 20, part 3. But for now, suffice to say, while they used to have class components be the kind of the main way to do things, functional components are now what they're really wanting people to use. They're encouraging everyone to switch to using functional components. You'll find that most people now that are actively developing with React are using functional components with, arrow functions and a lot of that syntax instead of class components. But they both exist because there's certainly a lot of code out there that's still going to have a lot of. So you need to know both. So they both return JSX to be converted to HTML by Babel, which we talked about last class. So those older syntax with class components, they extend the component class, and they have a render method that is what actually has the return with the JSX in it. So that's that. And then the other one, the functional components, essentially you just use the function, you pass in the data as props if you want to. You return JSX directly from the function. You don't have to have any sort of additional function inside a function or anything like that. So let's talk about each of these in turn. I'm going to start with the class-based ones, the old school. So you have to import the React object from the top. And I just realized that I have not done this example properly. Okay, there's two ways to do this. This is almost worth me like editing it on the spot, but I will show you how this works in a second when we live code some of this. But if you import React, then you need to extend react.component. If you deconstruct this and say, deconstruct component, then you can use it directly. And that's my bad. I'm sorry about that. I must have started to do it one way and changed my mind and then didn't fix it. But either way, you have to import from React so that you have access to that component class that you're extending through inheritance. And then the name of the JavaScript class should be in Pascal case. And you extend the component class and then define a render method that returns the JSX. So you can see in this example how I've done that. You don't have to use parentheses if the return value is a single line of JSX. And so you'll notice that I've got return and then I've just got, button, submit button without having parentheses around it. It's just because it's a single line of JSX, you can do that. If you do have multiple lines, then you use parentheses around it after the return. And then, of course, you want to add export to it if you're going to use it outside the module. And you can see in this case, it's not a default export. It's just a single, a regular export. So lots of keywords and not all of them are lined up properly. That's okay. And then this method, the render method, this is what is really different about a class-based component as opposed to a function-based component, is having to have that render method. And then there's the JSX you're returning, just a simple little, button. That's all it is. Okay, so function-based components, on the other hand, you could use the function keyword or a const with an anonymous function. It's up to you. Like I said, professionally, most of the time you'll see these days people using arrow functions. The name should be in Pascal case. The function should return the JSX. And this is an example of where you do use parentheses to enclose the JSX after the return because it has multiple lines. I also used this as an example where I needed a wrapper because you can't return multiple lines of JSX just like that. You have to have a parent tag, a parent element. And if you don't, for structural reasons, for styling reasons, if you don't actually want it to be a div or something like that, they have this thing called a fragment that's like a wrapper. It encloses it without actually messing with the hierarchy of things. So truly, in this case, these three things will be the children of whatever this is placed inside, because this is not really actually a real element. But it provides proper syntax for being able to return multiple lines that are on the same level like this. So react.fragment and then the empty one, either one of those will work. It's basically, this is just a shorthand for react.fragment. And it's what I see most of the time. So there's those keywords: export const on the name, author bio, and then return inside to return the JSX. Here's those wrapper tags. And that's pretty much it. So that's how to define these components. And then so you say, okay, well, how do we use them, right? So let's go over and let's say we have another component that we've created called button group. So you just place your component like it's a custom element. It's usually a self-closing tag. And then you just import it at the top. If it's actually defined elsewhere, it's possible to have multiple things defined in the same file under certain circumstances. Your studio will be that way tonight. One of your components, you're going to define two different functions. One of them is going to be used inside the other one, and then that one is the one that's actually going to be exported for use in another file. So depending on whether it's in another file or not, you may or may not need to import. But in this case, you can see, I've got these cancel button and submit buttons are both defined in a file called buttons, and I'm importing them so that I can use them both inside this new component in this file called button group. And so you just place it within the JSX, and then it'll return whatever JSX is returned from those will just be placed in that spot. The top level component that you could possibly put things in is app. But then you can kind of compose components with other components, all is, nested down as far as you want to go. So there's the import items, and there they are where they're placed in the JSX. Each of those two components. Okay, so let's go over and do some coding. We are going to start working on this new app we just created. And we're going to do a couple of quick things here, and then we're going to take a break. And once we do, we'll come back and do a little more. We're going to talk about props a little bit. We'll talk about CSS a little bit. But let's just focus on what I just talked about, creating and using regular components, simple components. So I'm going to come up into here, into the source directory here. I'm going to create a folder called components, which is where I'm going to put all of these components I'm defining. And the first one that I'm going to create is just a header. So I lost my, oh, here we go. I'm just going to create header.js. And in this particular instance, I'm going to give you an example of a class-based component so you can see how that looks. So I'm just going to, if it's class-based, and here again, this is where I messed up on the slide. So I can say import React from React, and I will show you in a second. I'm going to go ahead and put my export default here because I totally can on a class, and I'm just going to call it header and say it extends. And this is where I would say react.component. If I import React directly this way, then I have to do react.component here. However, if I want to deconstruct it, I can come in here and say component like this, pull the component class out of the React object, and then I don't need to reference it from the React object because I've deconstructed it. So this is what I think I intended for my slide to look like, one or the other, but not a strange combination of the two. It's misleading. I'll fix that slide later for you guys. All right, so remember with a class-based component, you can't return anything directly. You have to have a method, and that's the render method. So I'll have my render method, which is just classic format there for a JavaScript class. And then I'm going to have my return statement. In this case, I'm going to have 3 lines of JSX, so I'm going to use parentheses. And I am going to have just a simple div. Oh, no, that's not true. I'm going to have a header tag. I'm going to use the header element. And then I'm going to have an H3 inside of it that just says garden, planning tool. Okay. So this is going to be our header, garden planning tool. So I've defined it, but we don't actually see it on the page because I haven't placed it anywhere. Everything we're seeing is still that default content from the original app file. So let's come over here into app.js and get rid of this. You can see they have their own header defined here, right? So I'm going to remove that, and I'm actually going to remove this too. Until later, and then I'm just going to say I want header from components header, and watch this. When I do it like this, and I actually find it and then tab, it's going to put that import statement in there for me, so I don't have to come up and type it myself. That's a handy little thing, but you do have to finish this off. Self-closing, so I'm just going to put that slash in this, and now that is all finished up, you can see it says garden planning tool, and we have a blank page otherwise. So we are on our way to customizing this. Now, they had a whole bunch of CSS that they created that was in here that later I'm going to, no longer want to use. And both the app CSS and index CSS files are global. So that means that you can use the stuff from these anywhere in the application, and it will be able to find them. So I'm going to do some of that later, but I'm also going to show you the same way that your textbook does about how to use CSS modules that kind of go right along with each of your component files. So we'll see both, but we'll get there. We're going to do that after the break. So for now, we've gotten one of our things here. So that's great. Let me back over here. And the next one I want to do is a component called main. So I'm going to come back over here to components and create a new file and say main.js. And in here, I'm just going to create this one we're going to actually do as a functional component. And I'm going to do it as using a const. And I'm just going to call it const main and say equals no parameters, fat arrow, and then here's my body for this function. So I'm using an arrow function as an anonymous function to store in main. And inside here, let me come down. I'm going to return, sorry, give me just a second. I'm going to return multiple lines. So again, I'm going to need to use parentheses here. And I'm just going to use the main tag. And then inside of that, I'll do like a little H4. Oh no, my bad. I'm going to have a column. So I'm going to say div, and I'm going to give it an ID later, but for now we don't have any CSS in place, so I'm going to wait. And then inside the div is where I actually want to have an H4 that says available plants. So the idea here is that we're making a little app that allows me to see what plants I have available, and then I can actually designate them, like, allocate them to a flower bed and kind of plan out, how many of each flower type I'm going to use. This is kind of where we're headed with this. We're not going to get there tonight. We still have a lot to learn in the next couple of classes before this will be fully functional. We're going to build it a little bit at a time. So for now, I'm just going to kind of have something simple that'll just say, plants will be listed here. And I'll just kind of do that for now, because we're going to come back in a little bit. Once you know a little about props, we're going to create another component and have multiple instances of that same component here with different values. Okay, so again, I've defined this. I have not exported it. I should do that. I'm actually going to have to do it down here. So export default main. And that's all I need to do for now in order to be able to place it. Let me close these for now. Place it in here. So now that I come over here, there's a little more that I need to do with this to get it structured properly. So I'm going to come back to app.js, and I'm going to have the header and then main right below it. And then later we're going to come back and we're going to add a class to this div to help inform how this layout is going to go. Now, I did that without actually completing the import, so it's confused. But if I do like this and hit tab, there we go. Then it adds the import statement for me, and I don't have to type it in myself, but I do need to finish the tag. So there we go. And now it's happy. And we see garden planning tool and available plants, and plants will be listed here. So that's great. We already have information on the page coming from two different components that we defined separately. And what's interesting here is, if you haven't gotten your head around this yet, and that's totally okay, here's something that might help. Let's go look at the dev tools. And let me ramp this up a little bit so you can maybe actually read it, because I'm on a really big screen. I'll do the same over here. So if we come in here and we go into, start coming down in here, here's my header and there's my main. And this is all just regular HTML, right? That's all you're seeing. But it's coming from these separate components. You can see how when you start composing your page with all these different components coming from different places, how it all comes together and into a cohesive block of HTML. And that's what Babel does for you. It reads all that JSX, figures out exactly what your browser needs, and then renders it according to those needs. Okay, so this is good. Who has questions about what I've talked about so far? And then we'll get into props and CSS after the break. Mark?
It's a little bit off topic, I guess, but is this also how you can make very simple phone apps? Like, would you do this, or would you have to use a completely different kind of system?
React has a mobile version of it. It's called React Native. That I personally have not used, but I'm told that if you know React, you can pick up React Native very quickly. That is purposefully for that, yeah.
Okay, so is that like its own editor, or would you work through something like VS Code working with that? Is it, or is it like a totally different system?
So this is a different topic, but developing for mobile is interesting. I actually have done some of that professionally, where I've been working with a number of different apps. Some of it was React, some of it was Svelte or just regular JavaScript, but I was able to use my phone and actually use the browser dev tools on my laptop while working on my phone to, figure things out. And it depends on what your computer is and what your phone's operating system is, what that looks like. But if you have a Mac and an iPhone, it's pretty easy.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Carl.
Just a quick question. I noticed earlier when I did it, me and you both got the same output when we hit npm start. There's like, you had 3 and I had 6. It was like 3 high vulnerability.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know what that was, if that even really matter about the output.
You're going to see, okay, I can't see it right now, but you're going to see those warnings anytime you are working with stuff with npm where, as long as it just says warn, you really probably don't have to worry about it. Someone else out there who's managing the package is probably going to update it at some point. The only time you would have to worry about it is if it's warning you that something is deprecated to the point that the people who created that library or that dependency are no longer supporting it anymore. And they're telling you need to start using something different because we're not going to be supporting this anymore. It might break your application. That's pretty much it. But if it's an actual error, then it probably will not compile. And then you have to look into that. Yeah.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah. John.
Just really quickly, where can I find the code for this? Just yeah. Is it on Coding for Carrie? I'm on your website.
No, my lecture examples are not usually linked there unless I do some crossover. Sometimes I do. This is going to be just on my GitHub, and the link for it will be in the slides, which I will make available to you guys as soon as the lecture's over.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Nicole.
So I had a question about the slide that had the button group function on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was why I think it was the import statement for that, why it was why it was deconstructed. Like, why wouldn't you just import button group?
Well, because you could okay, so first of all, button group here is the name of the component I'm defining in this file. It's not necessarily the name of anything that's associated with buttons.js. Buttons.js just, in theory, because I don't actually have code examples for these, would have 2 defined components, cancel button and submit button. Both of them have been exported, but not by default. So if you wanted to not deconstruct, you'd have to do something like import buttons from, buttons.js, and then you'd have to say button.cancel button and button.submit button, or whatever you want to call it. You could call it cheese and say cheese.cancel button and cheese. It wouldn't matter. Just as long as, but you'd have to reference it off of an object, because that's what's being imported from the file is a whole object that has multiple exports. So deconstruction allows you to just reference them directly by name without having to worry about any of that.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Mohammed?
So I just had a quick question. So essentially components are where the HTML code would usually go, like from the original index.html file. Is this now where we start putting stuff?
Say that one more time.
So like are components like now where we start putting like the original HTML code that we would usually put in the index.html file, like when using React? Is this the purpose of components?
Okay, yeah, so let me show you how this works with relative to index.html, because it's an excellent question. It's something that I think might help you see how this breaks down. So the index.html file is up here in public. It has your usual head, like I'm going to be putting some Google fonts in here and stuff later. And then once you get down here, it's just got a div with an ID called root. And that basically means anything that is in your application is going to be inside root. You typically don't mess with this. And then down here in index, sorry. Let me make sure I've got this right. It's in app.js. App.js is actually placed somewhere else. Oh, index.js, I bet. Yeah. So index.js is where root is actually established. And it basically says, okay, I'm going to create that space and we're going to render the React application, and I'm going to place that app component in it. So this is your top level where all of the HTML that's going to be in the entire application is going to come from here in these files down here. But you typically don't edit this either for basic stuff. And then anything in app.js is where you start to break down and say how you want to compose what app looks like. So now I can have, header, I can have main, and then I'm going to go back into the definition for main and start composing it with more components from there. So it all just kind of comes down as a tree, essentially, where you've got that parent component, but then you just keep composing each component of other components, however you need in whatever fashion modularly.
Okay.
But ultimately, it forms up one big page of HTML that's rendered right there where it says root.
Okay.
It just places it all in here for you.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Freya?
I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more on exactly what render is doing, like why that's there, what it's doing in those places.
Okay, so you talking about where it was actually like from here?
There and in the example in your
The
slide.
header, yeah, because I did it here too, yeah. Because when you have a class-based component, in order for it to execute, like return this, it has to execute something, and that something is that render method that you define. And essentially, it just means here's what I want you to send to the page for this component. This is what I want you to build in and render as HTML. Because right now it's a combination of JavaScript and HTML. It's JSX.
So it's kind of like a blank slate, like do something.
Yeah, it just means because every time the beauty of React is that every time the user interacts with the page on some level, it can be as simple as a click event or a hover event, or maybe they submit a whole form and there's a whole lot going on. But anytime there's a change that is going to actually change something on the page, that render reruns. We're going to talk more about life cycles when we get to part 3. And that's when you'll really start to understand how this works. For tonight, we're working with mostly static information. So it's going to call render once and put it on the page, and then it's not going to call it again because we're not updating any state or using any more life cycles after that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Eris?
Hi, just have a question about the templates, like a logo or whatever is over there. So it's like all necessity is like it can be removed or add, like we add components over there.
They've got this SVG here that is the logo that they were using, and we totally don't have to keep this. So yeah, you can delete that kind of stuff out once you're sure you're not using it anymore. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Gabe, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, so I know that you mentioned that older versions of React were more class oriented and now it's more functional component oriented. I'm curious, like what is there like a particular advantage to one versus another in general, or is it just because of the modern syntax?
Yeah, it's again, it'll be easier to explain this in part 3, but class 20. But they made some changes that made functional components much more powerful, and the syntax is preferred for a variety of reasons. But now that you can actually handle like these things called hooks that help you manage the state of your variables and things, and help with the life cycles and all of that, you can use those now in functional components, which you couldn't before. It means, oh, great, now we can use functional components for everything, and we don't have to use class components necessarily, and they're just more flexible and easier to write, especially when you just want to create a teeny tiny little component for something. I mean, it's yeah, it's better. Yeah, it's been headed a good direction. You can certainly go to the React documentation and read up on it if you'd like, but it'll help once we get through the next couple of classes. It'll, I think, help. I'll be able to illustrate it a little better.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's go ahead and we get past this. Let's go ahead and take our 5-minute break. And when we come back, we will talk about props in CSS. Great, welcome back, everyone. Let's talk about props. Again, I just want to reiterate, your chapters don't really get into this much until part 2. But I want to go ahead and just introduce you to the basics of it tonight, so that you kind of already have that under your belt before we really start using it more fully in the next couple of classes. Okay, so if you want to make your components reusable, you need to know about props. Props allow you to pass data into a component so that you can have the same component take different values and produce different results without having to have a lot of repeated code. The component can be very generic, and it can just accept those specific values you're passing in. And then you would place the prop on the component's tag as an attribute. So right now I'm showing you how you would pass the props in once you are using, like for example, I've got this text input that I've created here, and I'm using it twice, but with different values. So you would do each of the props as an attribute. So these have, ID and label, you can see here. And then the value is whatever value you want to pass in. That's the value you put for the attribute. So I'm saying I want to use this text input component, and I want it to be specifically have the values of first name for ID and first name formatted for view on the page as the label for that input. And then I'm doing the same thing here again. I'm saying I want to use another instance of that exact same component, but I just want to give it different values this time. So this is how you do that. This is how you pass in different values to display it differently each time you use it. And then, I might have, my button after that or whatever. So that's just one example. So that's how you actually pass them in. But how do you set up, how do you define the component, this text input component to begin with, so that it can accept these props, ID and label, and then make use of them? You pass it, basically you use this props, and it's a single object that you're passing in. And you can use any variable name you want to, but props is kind of the convention for a major component. And then every single actual prop name, like ID and label, those are keys as part of that object. So you can access it with dot notation like I've done here, or you can also deconstruct them. I'll show you an example of that in a bit. So again, here's that parameter. So I'm defining my text input component here, export const text input. But instead of having no parameters, I'm giving it a parameter. I'm calling it props by convention. And then I can access all of my props from that and say, I want my ID to be this concatenated, input dash, and then whatever the ID is. So I say props.id to access it. And then down here, I actually return my JSX, and I've got the input with the ID, the label that's for that input with the ID, and then I actually display on the page for the label, props.label, whatever that text is that's passed in. So that's how you actually define it so that it can accept them, and you use those values wherever you want as variables, so that every time this component is used, it can be unique and it's not hard-coded values the exact same time. So it's reusable. This is great. Let's see. There's those properties that the ID and the label. Okay. So I mentioned that you can do this with dot notation, and you can also deconstruct it. I will give you an example of that with the next thing we do with this project. So let's go back over and do this. And we're probably going to do this in reverse order. I'm going to define it first and then place it. But I'm going to create another component here. If we go back to our main component, you can see I kind of just have this little paragraph here that says plants will be listed here. Well, what I really want is to have multiple plants be listed where I use the same component over and over again. So for example, I can have some test data, and this is how it works in development, guys. Like, you aren't usually like fetching your actual data that you're using from the database, like through an API. immediately. When you're first just creating something for the first time, you can just create dummy data or test data. So for this particular one inside here, I'm just going to say, okay, I want to just have some test plants. These are the objects that are the same, that kind of will be like what I create when I get the JSON, when I actually fetch it. But that's not something that we're going to do until class 20, because we need to make use of state and life cycles to do that. So I'm just going to work with dummy data for a while I'm getting all this stuff set up and, creating kind of a proof of concept. And then we can switch to using real data later. So for now, I've just got 3 plants, hyacinths, tulips, and daffodils. They're different colors. They've got different images. There's different, numbers available. And I want to be able to display these each with that information here. Now, ultimately, next class, we are going to make it like a real pretty card with the picture and, some interesting information and buttons on it. Today, it's just going to be like a line of, information, but it will prove this whole thing of how you can use the exact same component over and over again with different information and pass it in as props and have it display it differently. So let's first go over, and so we're just going to have this test data. This is what we want to use, and we're going to replace this right here with multiple instances of a new component that I'm going to call available plants. So I'm going to come over here to components and say I want to create another file, and we're going to call it available plants .js. And I'm going to essentially, let's see, do I need to, no, I don't need to do that yet. Okay. I'm going to create just a const available plant. We'll do this as a simple functional component. And this time I'm going to use props. So I'm going to say, okay, props is going to be my parameter. And you can put this in parentheses, but you might remember that with arrow functions, if you only have exactly one parameter, you don't have to use the parentheses. So that's what I've done here. It can be harder to read when you're not used to this, but I want to expose you to all of that because you guys have to learn how to read this kind of code because that's what you're going to see all over the place. Okay, so the first thing to do is to get the props. And I actually want to use deconstruction. So I'm going to say use deconstruction for individual props. So I can just unpack them and say, let's go get them out of here. And I can say, the prop itself, okay, to be fair, I'm only going to have one. I'm actually only going to have one prop, and it's going to be called plant. But plant is going to be an object with multiple things. So what I'm going to do here is deconstruct the prop itself and say ID, name, color, and num available. I'm not interested in the image for today, but these are the other 4 properties that I do want. And I'm just going to say props.plant. So I'm going to go to the props object. I'm going to go to the plant object that's being passed in, and I'm going to grab each of these and assign these variable names so that I can just start referring to them by name directly and not having to use a lot of dot notation. Because props.plant.id and props.plant.name, et cetera, that gets really old really fast. This is why deconstruction is so great. Okay, so I'm going to return a single line. It's just going to be a paragraph for now. I'm going to give it an ID that's just ID. And then between the tags, I'm going to just say I want name, and then a hyphen, and then, color, and then a hyphen. We're going to go super simple, guys. No fancy cards yet. And then num available, have the text available on there. Okay, so this is just going to produce a string that's made up of all, using these placeholders, these JSX placeholders for each of these variables that I deconstructed out of props.plant. And now I should be able to give a different plant every time I, use this available plant component over in main. And then it should come out differently every time because now I've made it where it's flexible. It can be reusable over and over again. So I'll come back over to main, and up at the top, actually, I could do the import statement, but as we've learned that we don't have to. If I just start to type it in, it'll give me the option of just tabbing over. So I'm going to say available plants, and if I go to the top, there's nothing there. And that's because I forgot to export it. Sure enough. Okay. I'm going to do it here. Export default available plant. Okay. Now, if I do that again, so you can always do things again. It's really okay. There it is. Now it knows where it is. You see that on the right? That was my first clue. Okay. Yeah, and now the import statement is at the top, which is nice. Okay, so I can say available plant, but I haven't actually passed anything in. So if I come over here and it says I can't destructure the property of ID because props.plan is undefined. So it's already yelling at you because you haven't actually put the required, parameter on it. So I'm going to say plant equals, and then I'm just going to access test plants for now because that's what we're using to test as data. Test plants at index 0. So we'll give it the first plant using this placeholder here and pass it in as that prop. And look what we have. Hyacinth blue 8 available. Great. So all I have to do now is, add a couple of more. And I'll just say, make this one, 1 and this one 2. And you're probably thinking right now, well, Carrie, why do we have to have 3 of these? Isn't there a way to loop through them? And yes, there are. We're going to do that next class. For now, I'm just going to keep it hard coded this way, where you just see them individually. We use the bracket notation to access each one of those elements separately so that you can see we're passing in a different object here, but they all have the same properties: ID, name, color, image, num available. So we can count on, we can count on the data having that, all of those keys. Therefore, we can deconstruct all of those keys from props.plant now that plant's been passed in as a prop. And now that's why it makes it available here. Okay, so before I actually go in, I don't formally have a question stopping point, but before we get into the CSS, does anybody have any questions about this? We'll talk about it again next class. Nope. Okay, cool. All right. So hopefully that's a helpful introduction to how props work. This is a pretty simple way to do it, but it's great because I have established this available plant component once, and I'm able to use it multiple times with different data each time. This is really what's valuable about React. So tonight when you do your studio, you're not going to be doing any of this. You're not going to be passing any props in, and everything you do in the different components you create is just hard-coded data, kind of like, me creating this test data here. That's what you're doing tonight. So it's not going to be super fancy. It's just to give you a feel for how to start to use all this syntax. Yumi, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. Could you just quickly explain one more time what the relationship is between the props variable and the plant variable? I think I missed something there.
Yeah, you can, I know it doesn't seem to connect directly. So here's the concept. You can name this anything you want. I could name this Christmas and it would still work. But props is the convention, and it's just an object that gets passed in that React automatically knows to use that, so that if you place any sort of props on your component when you use it like this, like I've created this attribute plant, it knows to make that part of that props object. So now over here, I can say props.plant to access it. And so because that plant is an object, I'm deconstructing from the plant object, not from props. If I had multiple props, I might deconstruct from props directly. But Gabe?
Yeah, follow on, I guess, from that question. So does that mean you could pass multiple objects through in a prop at once?
Yeah, you can have lots of props. I mean, if I wanted to, I could have said, okay, available plant ID equals and name equals and color equals, but they were already nicely encapsulated in a single object, which makes it nice to be able to just say, let me just pass you the whole plant. And then we can deconstruct, all of the parts of the plant from there in here in one place. It's a lot, as you can imagine, this code would get a lot messier if I was doing it that way. But yeah, but I could say, you know, maybe there's some other feature that I want, you know, to have something variable about this that I'd want to pass in. Then you would have multiple props and you would access them the same way, props dot this, props dot that. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on because we've only got a little bit of time left, and I want to talk about the CSS, and it's going to take me a minute to kind of set up some things. But let's talk about it first here, and then we will come back over to the code. So to use CSS with React, there are so many different ways to do it. One way is to put global CSS into the index.css file. I also mentioned that the app CSS file is global. That's true as well. You can import a style sheet as a module. That's the way that your book does it, and it's the way that we're going to do this tonight. You can see here, import styles from about.module.css that relates to an about.js file, right? That's kind of the idea here, is that for each module, JavaScript module, you'll also have a CSS module that corresponds to it. But I'm going to do a little of both for my lecture example. For your studio, you're going to be doing just the module way, I think. And then there's other ways you can do it. You can use libraries, like styled components is something I have used with React that I love because it allows you to just put the CSS at the top of your component file and everything's in one file, but it's like right there. So you can still have global stuff, but you can have stuff that's only used in that one component, and you can just define it right there at the top of the file. Styled components is cool. I've also used Bootstrap. So there's lots of different ways to go. But we're gonna stick simple with keeping things, you know, real explicit so that nothing's too abstracted for you guys as you're learning this, because we're only really just scraping the surface in these 3 classes to give you kind of a foundational understanding of React. Okay, so hang on a second. Let me see how far I need to go here. I feel like I'm missing. Yeah, there we go. Oh yes, I should point this out. This is important. So you can't use the class attribute for putting CSS classes on an element with JSX because JSX is JavaScript. So, and you know, class is a reserved name in JavaScript, right? So instead, React says use class name and it'll convert it. It knows what to do with it from there to convert it and actually use it as a styling class from there. So you're going to have to get used to that because if you're really used to using just class with CSS, it might take a bit before you remember to always use class name, but that's what you need to do. All right, so let's go over and actually do it. I'm going to have to put some things in place in order to do this. Give me just a second. I've got a number of styling things that I want to do here. One is that I'm going to create, oh yeah, I need to do that here actually. So in my source folder, you know, we have components, right? And all of these like top level files. I'm going to add a new folder called assets. And then I'm going to add another folder inside that called images. And that's where I'm going to put any images I need for this that I want to actually just be part of the project and not like, you know, pull in as a link from somewhere else. Tonight for your studio, you're actually just going to use links for your images. So you won't have to worry about this. So I have that existing now. I can go over here to, I'm off on my other screen for a second, guys. Give me just a moment. Oh, I accidentally put that inside components and I did not mean to. Let me move this out. Okay. Oh, it's being really dumb. Okay. Let me just delete this. I'm sorry, guys. Give me just a second. Sometimes VS Code is dumb. I probably should have just done this in the command line and then I would have been sure of what I was doing and it wouldn't have been so tricky. Okay. Assets. There we go. That's what I want. I want it to be in the same level as components. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to move a file over here for now. And so we've got a background file in there now, and then I'm going to go into index.html and I'm going to go into the head here right below the title, just because it's, you know, easy. There's a lot of comments in here, and that's okay. And then I'm gonna just grab some links that I need for my Google fonts. So, you know, I like to make use of other stuff from the outside, and this is how you do it. Oh, and this one actually is for Font Awesome, which gives you like all these cool little like, you know, icons and stuff, which I'll be making use of. And then I'm going to go into, see, do I need to go into index.css? Let me make sure. I think I may have put some things in one and some things in another. Okay, yeah, because I wanted to show you how this works. I'm going to have a lot of really top level global stuff in here, body and div and H2, you know, just element type selectors. And then in app, I'm going to put the things that are going to apply directly to this component, which really is just one thing that a class we're going to add at the app component level. And then I will actually create the files that I need for these other components that I created. So main and header and available plant. And so let's go to, nope. Sorry. I gotta make sure I'm actually on the right one, as I have learned. Okay, I'm gonna create a file. I'm gonna create one for main called main.module.css. And then I'll create another one for header.module.css. And I just realized I'm not going to create the one for available plant yet. We're going to do that next class because I'm keeping that simple with text for right now. I'll just add it for the starter code before we start next time. So for main, I'm going to add just a couple of things here. I'm going to add a definition for, that didn't come out right. It's happening. Sorry, guys. Oh, goodness. I'm trying to copy and paste from something that's being a little bit stubborn. Here we go. That's just going to be for the main element itself, and then this left column ID that we're going to add. And then the last one will be for the header that I'm just going to have a little bit of styling that's specific to the header. Now, the decisions that you make as a developer about where you decide to, you know, to apply your stuff, there's lots of different ways to do it. Typically, you're probably going to be at a company where they have like very specific standards for how they do things, and they're going to have kind of their own conventions for things, and you just kind of, you know, when in Rome kind of approach, right? And you just ask, how am I supposed to structure this? So this is a little bit chopped up, right? I've got some things in different places that correspond, but I'm just showing you examples of how you can do it different ways. That's mainly the thing here. Okay, so I have all of the CSS in place. That's great. Now I need to use it. So I'm going to come over to app first of all, and go to app.js. And here, I just want to add the ID page layout. Okay. And we can see already we've got a background in place. The layout looks a little bit different now, but it's not quite right. We still got to add some more things in some other places. So let me go over to main. And here, we're going to learn kind of how to use these. I don't remember if I finished this slide. Hold on. Yeah, let me finish talking about this. So you import the CS definitions from the module if you're doing it this way. And then to use it, you have to use it, you know, based on that styles object that you're, you know, is representing all these CSS definitions. If you have something that is easily converted into, you know, valid JavaScript, then you can just say .small. If you have something like this where it's hyphenated, which is how a lot of CSS classes are defined, or in this case, you know, maybe it's even just a, it's not a class, but it might be, you know, something else like an ID selector. You just have to use bracket notation so that you can put the quotes around it, and then it works. So you can actually do it either way, so that whatever CSS you've got, you can find a way to use it if you do it this way. You don't have to import anything if it's in one of those global files, but if you're using it from a module like this, you do. So keeping that in mind, that means that up here at the top, I need to import the styles. So I'm going to say import styles from, and I'm going to go to main, .module.css. And then down here, I can add to the div here, in order to control the layout of the things inside of it, I'm going to add an ID, and I'm going to use the placeholder so that I can actually reference styles. And then because it's hyphenated, I'm going to use bracket notation with quotes and say left column. Just remember that rule that, you have to use bracket notation if it's, hyphenated or has spaces in it or anything like that. And this case, it does have hyphen. So that'll take care of that. I think everything else here is normal. So let's go take a look at it. Yeah, okay, this is what I was expecting to see. The spacing is a little wonky in a couple spots. I'll have to sort that out. But oh yeah, there's still something not right about header. Hold on. I think we're missing something on header. Maybe not. Oh, oh yeah. Okay, so the only thing you still have to import if you want it to apply selectors that are like, element selectors. So even though you're not placing any sort of like ID or class on it, if you have the styles defined in that, and this is meant to be header, of course. There we go. So you see how this just changed up here? Something is still not quite right, but you can see how it went ahead and updated the background and everything. So I imported styles. I don't need to reference styles because I'm not placing an ID or a class on anything, but I did, if you remember, define something for header itself for just the element selector. So that's here, yeah. And see, that's supposed to be white. And so I'm not sure why the text isn't white. Something else is going on. Oh, you know what? I think I switched out my, I'll bet you anything. Give me just a second. H2s and H3s, this is my problem. Okay, so if I go back to here. Yeah, I forgot I switched these out. So this is supposed to be an H3 now. I didn't have my solution updated, and I had to like push the code over the break because I realized it wasn't quite right. Okay, and so I come here and make this an H2, and now these should be formatted the way they're supposed to. See, this is what happens when I change my mind. Okay, yeah, that looks much better. Okay, so we have, you can see where the Google fonts come in. I've got, a nice little header here. I've got this left column selection section that has the H3, and then it's got the list that we created by using those, 3 different instances of the available plant component and passing in a different object for each one. And that's it. That's all we've got for today. But this is the basics. I just want you guys to kind of have a sense of the fundamentals of all of this. All right. Does anybody have any questions about the CSS stuff that I just did? Madeline?
Yeah, I have a question that's sort of about workflow, and you might have addressed this and I got distracted, but I'm just wondering if you would have coded that in just HTML and CSS first. Like I find that tricky, and like when I've tried to style things while writing the JavaScript, I'm like, this looks ugly.
I have in part a graphic design background, and but I also remember what learning HTML in 1995 was like, which there was black and white and Times New Roman, nothing pretty at all, and 256 colors at my disposal only. So I feel your pain, and it is very hard for me to force myself to work on the meat of the the content before I work on the styling, but I have learned to make myself do it because it's important to get the functional aspects down first. I mean, you have to have a vision, and your company is going to have a design team probably that has come up with wireframes of exactly what the layouts are supposed to be, for different flows of the site as the user's navigating through things, depending on what they click on and whatever. They should have all that figured out. And then, at least if you're in my position as a front end engineer, my job is to wire it all up and make it look like how they designed it. So I start with the basics and then I start adding those things in. But if you are designing it all of it all at once, like I do all these lecture examples and all the stuff on my website for you guys, it really kind of all comes together at the same time for me. I work on it, in bits and pieces. It's a skill to learn how to manage all of that. And different people might have different priorities, and your role also plays part in that. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think so. I think my question is like, I mean, I think you answered it. You said, sorry, I have a 3-year-old here. It really wants to be involved. But you said you would work on it all at once, right? Like, so you'd sort of be fiddling with the CSS while you're defining it in React and everything.
Maybe. Okay. So let me think about it this way. You're going to probably, as you get towards Unit 3, when you're learning about agile methodologies and like how to approach a very large project and to work on it a little bit of time, you're going to learn how to like separate and say, I'm going to work on this part just over here and get it working right. And then I'm going to work on just this part over here. And there's kind of 2 elements to that. One is like, you really don't start too many things until you finish some of them. But there's also the idea of agile is that you do everything on what's called a minimum viable product level. So it's just the bare bones and it doesn't have to be super fancy. And you get it all working that way first. And then you come back and take another pass at everything and make it, even better, and add more features and, make it fancier. And that, again, how that is defined, it can vary from company to company, but those are all skills that you'll be picking up as you start working on more complex things. Justin?
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, so it's not really pertaining to this, it's pertaining to what you just said. So in Unit 3, when we start learning about Agile, will we be using some kind of tracking program to keep track of that and get experience with that? Something like, for example, Jira?
Yeah, you'll probably use Trello. It's free. Everybody can set it up really quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you guys are going to learn all about Kanban boards and all that stuff. So things to look forward to. Okay, I have to get you guys off to Studio, but Studio will be a little simpler than what I did tonight, but I wouldn't say it's going to be simple, but it will walk you through it and tell you how to do it step by step. They provide almost all the code for you, and then you just have to customize it a little bit, but I'll get you there. Oh yeah, so I do not have any beginner level React exercises available on my website for today, sorry, because this is new and I haven't had time. I do have some more advanced ones that are at least one of them is something you could probably do after the 3rd class, after class 20. But I will introduce it at that time. So for now, there's lots of other like very beginner practice things out there. You can Google it. React is very popular. You can find other little small tutorials if you really want extra practice getting the basics down. But we'll continue to unpack this over the next couple classes, and then I will be able to hand you some things that you might delve into after that. So you've got React Part 2 coming up on Monday and Part 3 on Thursday. And then the following week is your catch-up class on Monday the 14th. That's the day that all assignments are due by midnight. And then we'll have a break on Thursday the 17th. And then Unit 2 begins on Monday the 21st. We have a very fast turnaround this time. You can be thinking of Colin because he has a lot of work to do for sure. So that's pretty much it for that. Let's talk about Studio. So you're gonna do this favorite recipes type of thing, and it's gonna be a little bit super basic for now. But you'll use Create React App to add a new project to your existing repo. You're not creating a new Git repo. You're just gonna add, you're gonna create it within the Part 1 folder so that it'll be right alongside that exercises folder that's already in there. Then you'll create several components as instructed. You'll arrange them on the page and add a little bit of CSS here and there that they've already provided for you. And then just make sure that you're making commits as you go. This is not something that I typically demo for you while I'm lecturing. I wish I could, it takes up more time. But do that, stop and make commits every time you finish yet another piece, because that's really the good practice you want to get into. So I will let you guys go and get into that. And I will have the video for the lecture and the video for the studio walkthrough later tonight.